A Short Masonic History by Frederick Armitage. Forward. There is perhaps no subject of a more elusive nature upon which to discourse than that of the secret societies which served as the progenitors of modern Freemasonry. Indeed, the earliest of these organizations remain shrouded in obscurity, their records requiring meticulous excavation from the works of sundry chroniclers to be assembled like a mosaic. Conversely, in the case of subsequent societies, their historians have persistently striven to discover some ancient prototype, frequently permitting their imaginations unfettered license. Succeeding authors, overawed by the allure of their subject, have solemnly perpetuated the whimsical conjectures of their predecessors, with the result that the eventual harvest of information consists of a heterogeneous mixture of grain and cornflowers. From such narratives, it behooves the contemporary writer to distinguish the historical from the fictitious, and to relate the history in its proper and authentic manner. Whether the author has succeeded in this endeavor must be left to the judgment of his readers. However, he wishes to express here his gratitude for the invaluable assistance derived from the transactions of the Lodge of the Four Crowned Ones, now widely recognized as the preeminent scholarly society of Freemasonry, whose efforts, it is hoped, will in due course illuminate many of the currently obscure pages in the history of the craft and of other esoteric fraternities. Frederick Armitage, P.M. July, 1909. Chapter 1. The Origins of Secret Societies. In those ancient times of which Virgil sings, when weaponry and the prowess of masculine exploits were esteemed far above all intellectual attainments, it is scarcely surprising to observe that whenever an individual of genius emerged among the populace, he immediately gathered about him a small yet devoted circle of like-minded adherents. Such an assemblage evolved either into a school wherein the master's philosophy was inculcated, as exemplified by the Pythagoreans, a sect wherein the leader's religious doctrines were expounded, as instanced by the Jesuits, a society wherein political objectives were propagated, such as the Orange Institution, or a guild wherein the interests of a specific craft or trade were promoted, such as that of the operative Masons in England. Artisans in various trades have in all eras found it necessary to pursue and secure employment wherever it might be obtained, thereby becoming itinerant wanderers from town to town, and from city to city. A stranger arriving in a locality and claiming to be a skilled craftsman was subjected to rigorous scrutiny and required to provide evidence, not only of his technical proficiency, but also of his regular apprenticeship and legitimate initiation into the trade or craft. What measure, therefore, could be more efficacious than to transform the guild into a secret society, equipped with a system of signs and passwords which, when correctly rendered, would serve as the hallmark of a genuine member of an association whose membership betokened both experience and expertise. The history of civilization is suffused with such societies, which have emerged periodically, run their course, and dissolved, until in subsequent epochs another organization has arisen, utilizing the embers of a predecessor to kindle its own spark of existence. Consequently, it is highly probable that, despite harboring diverse objectives, these societies frequently shared similarities of thought and ritual, which were either inspired by or extensively plagiarized from their precursors. A singular point of resemblance pervades them all, namely, the employment of symbols or a pictorial language, from which moral precepts were derived and enshrined in a ritual of a quasi-religious character. This ritual provided an appropriate framework for the administration of a solemn oath, binding the members never to improperly disclose the signs and passwords to the uninitiated. The concept of symbolism was undoubtedly derived from the religions they professed. The rites of the ancient Egyptians, the pagan worship of the Greeks, and the liturgy of the Christians were replete with pictorial and other representations of their respective truths. The representations of the lamb and the eagle were universally recognized symbols, while the key, the anchor, and the ship constituted another category, each possessing its own moral lesson to impart. In like manner, the heraldic coats of arms borne by knights during the medieval period were entirely symbolic of the virtues presumed to be possessed by their bearers. The defining characteristics of all secret societies from antiquity are twofold. First, an initiation ceremony for the candidate, prior to which he was required to furnish proof of his character and suitability for the fraternity, and during which he bound himself by an oath to safeguard the secrets entrusted to his care. Secondly, to protect the authentic brother from the impetuous intruder or the spurious charlatan or cowan, who sought to practice the craft without having served a legitimate apprenticeship. There existed signs and passwords that could only be communicated by those who had been duly initiated. It is a widely accepted premise that when two distinct bodies exhibit similar regulations, the one has been modeled upon the other, unless both derive from a common ancestor. In this manner, the historical continuity between ancient and modern secret societies has been maintained, although there are certain critics who contend that such resemblances are attributable to the general doctrine of psychical identity, a pretentious phrase denoting that, by sheer coincidence, two minds may arrive at the same truth simultaneously through independent lines of thought. The hypothesis of two copyists replicating a single original, drawing an analogy from the behavior of schoolboys, appears, however, to be the simpler and more probable explanation. Chapter 2. The Persians. Among ancient civilizations, the worship of the sun was one of the most conspicuous and universally practiced of religious rites. To the agrarian mind, the cultivation of cereal crops, both for human sustenance and for the pasturage of livestock, constituted the primary necessity of life, and since both endeavors depended fundamentally upon the sun, it was consequently esteemed the most potent force of nature, and thus a deity to be adored. It likewise required propitiation, for it could prove a bane as well as a blessing. In the absence of water, it engendered famines, and in desert regions, it was the source of those afflictions common to the East, namely sunstroke and ophthalmia, induced by the intense glare of light upon the head and eyes. The worship of the sun was therefore almost universally practiced by Oriental nations, including the Persians, the Assyrians, and all those tribes whose territories bordered the Hebrew nations during Old Testament times. Repeatedly, the Israelites are recorded as having adopted the customs of their neighbors. Indeed, King Solomon, following the construction of the temple, engaged in the ancient pagan worship, and no deity was more familiar to the populace of Palestine than Baal, the sun god. It was manifest that the sun arose in the east, attained its meridian in the south at midday, and sank in the west at the close of day. Thereafter, it vanished from view, prompting the question of its nocturnal course. The deities were supposed to take possession of it, place it within a golden goblet, and navigate it across a northern ocean until it reached the east once more on the following morning. Aristotle, while dismissing the theory of a maritime voyage, believed that the sun was somehow transported during the night across the northern regions, and that darkness was caused by towering mountains which obscured the sunbeams during this transit. It is therefore scarcely surprising that the concept of the sun's diurnal progress through the heavens was readily adopted by those societies which, behind closed doors, performed their secret rites or mysteries, as they preferred to designate them, and transmitted to their successors elements of a ritual wherein this daily path from north to east, and from east to west was replicated, with the East established as the place of honor in their assemblies. The most ancient of these societies was in all likelihood established in that land of guarded secrets, Tibet, where the sacred lamas, if we are to credit modern exponents of their practices, possessed a corpus of secret doctrines, now designated as esoteric or hidden mysteries, which may or may not be accurately interpreted by contemporary theosophists. Immediately contiguous to their territory dwelt the Persians, whose religious system was established upon the worship of the deity of light and fire. The appellation fire worshippers is widely recognized, and the supreme pontiff of this order was Zoroaster, who is traditionally depicted in sculptural reliefs with a radiant sun encircling his head. He undoubtedly performed sacred mysteries within the secluded recesses of caverns and subterranean labyrinths, the knowledge of which he is reputed to have acquired from Upper Egypt. Fire and light were regarded merely as manifestations or offspring of the sun, the supreme divinity to whom all directed their devotion. Indeed, they invariably venerated their fire altars with their countenances turned toward the solar orb. With the emergence of a more elevated sacerdotal class and the acquisition of rudimentary chemical knowledge, it was entirely natural that these priests should arrogate to themselves supernatural powers, practicing the arts and experiments of those who, in subsequent eras, would be designated as alchemists. The term magic served as an earlier designation for these pursuits, and consequently, the Persian priesthood came to be known as the Magi or magicians. The hegemony of Persia attained its zenith during the Epic of Cyrus, who vanquished the armies of Babylon in 538 BC. Subsequently, the Persian hosts overran Egypt and Greece until, during the reign of Darius, they suffered defeat by the Greeks on land at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, and at sea in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. It is highly probable that through these campaigns, Persia acquired familiarity with certain Egyptian magical arts. A figure of preeminent significance in relation to the study of secret societies is the Greek scholar Pythagoras, to whom subsequent reference will be made, who undeniably studied and observed some of the Egyptian rites. Certain chroniclers assert that during his sojourn in Egypt, he was abducted by the Persian monarch, Cambyses, thereby gaining first-hand acquaintance with the Magi, from whom he acquired a portion of their esoteric secrets. This narrative, however, lacks historical corroboration, and it remains highly improbable that these clandestine arts would have been imparted to an outsider. The Persian Magi are conjectured to be the historical prototypes of the wise men from the East who paid homage to Christ after his nativity, although certain commentators contend that these Eastern sages originated from the land of the Chaldeans. These Persian philosophers are also believed to be alluded to in the Old Testament, wherein it is recorded that the wisdom of Solomon surpassed that of all the children of the East country, as well as the entire wisdom of Egypt. There appears to be little doubt that, in common with the Hebrews and other Oriental nations, a significant portion of the erudition of these magi was dedicated to the interpretation of dreams. The Eastern mind, steeped in vivid and picturesque imagery, recapitulated these visions in slumber, attributing to them diverse and profound import. To formulate a neologism that subsequently integrates into the global lexicon is indicative of the distinction of either the individual or the nation that conceived it. Such a distinction, if indeed it may be so termed, attaching to the creation of a word carrying far from pleasant connotations, belongs to Persia. Within this realm originated the Society of the Assassins, whose history is inextricably linked with that of their adversaries, the Knights Templar. The Assassins derived their name either from the Oriental drug hashish, an extract of opium wherewith the members of the society stimulated their imaginations, or from the name of their founder, Hassan ben Sabah. The adherents of Islam, following the demise of Muhammad in 632 AD, fractured into two factions regarding the identity of his legitimate successor as caliph. One body comprised the Sunnis or Orthodox Muslims, predominantly situated in Turkey, while the other constituted a heterodox faction known as the Shiites, who comprised the Muslim population of Persia. The Shiites subsequently bifurcated into two factions over a similar dispute regarding the rightful imam, or high priest. The adherents of the new branch were termed Ismailis, who contended that the office of the imam should devolve upon Ismail, the eldest son of Ali, the deceased priest. Unsurprisingly, the consequence of these schisms was that the newly formed body of Ismailis developed novel interpretations of their faith. Departing from the strict tenets of the Quran, they formulated an esoteric doctrine asserting that all religions were human fabrications, that good and evil were not absolute values, and that expediency was to be the sole arbiter of right and wrong. Consequently, they aligned themselves with the freethinkers of their nation, who were represented among the Persian Magi, and placed themselves under the leadership of a magus named Abdallah. This individual, who professed a profound antipathy toward the Arabs and their faith, is reputed to have established a secret society of his own. The Ismailis subsequently migrated to Egypt, where they succeeded in elevating a descendant of Ismail to the throne. A lodge of their secret society was established in Cairo, while its emissaries dispersed across Asia, their objective being to enthrone their own caliphs as the supreme heads of the Islamic faith, thereby supplanting the authority they deemed spurious at Baghdad. It was during this epoch that Hassan ben Sabah journeyed to Egypt, where he became a fervent initiate of the Ismaili lodge. He subsequently repaired to Alimut in Persia, where in 1090 he instituted the Order of the Assassins, installing himself as the Grand Master or Sheikh al-Jabal, signifying the Master of the Mountain, owing to the situation of the town of Alimut upon a lofty eminence, though in Europe he became widely known as the Old Man of the Mountain. The order comprised 7 distinct degrees. The first was that of the Master. The second consisted of 3 Grand Priors. The third comprised the initiated masters or dais. The fourth, the companions or refiques. The fifth, the devoted or fedavis. The sixth, the novices or lafex. And the seventh, the profane or ordinary members. For the initiated, there existed a ritual encompassing 7 precepts, which demanded absolute obedience to the master, inviolable secrecy, and an injunction that the interpretation of the Holy Quran must be allegorical rather than literal, thereby permitting any construction that served the exigencies of the moment. This esoteric interpretation, however, was disclosed solely to the initiated, while the remaining members were obliged to await such revelations as were imparted to them. The 5th class, or fedavis, constituted the active agents of the order. They were customarily attired in white garments adorned with a red fez and girdle, though when dispatched on a mission, they were permitted to assume whatever disguise they deemed appropriate. When summoned to action, the fedavi was stupefied with hashish, inducing vivid and fantastical visions. He was thus led to believe that he had entered the paradise of the Prophet, and that death, should it overtake him, would serve as the portal to an exquisitely blissful afterlife. Although the society was assaulted by the Sultan of Turkey, the fedavis executed their lethal assignments whenever and wherever they were commanded. The assassins expanded their influence into Syria and Tripoli, where they amassed formidable power until the demise of their master, Hassan, in 1124. He bequeathed his authority to his successor, Buzorg, who subsequently established contact with Baldwin II, the Crusader king of Jerusalem, through the mediation of Hugh de Pagans, the Grand Master of the Temple, whereupon they agreed to ally their forces against the Saracens. The assassins appear to have operated as mercenary agents in their warfare, with both a caliph of Baghdad and a sultan of Cairo falling victim to their clandestine designs. The Templars, however, proved to be the stronger power, forcing the assassins to submit to an annual tribute of 40,000 gold ducats. The latter attempted to secure the remission of this levy by proposing to Almeric, king of Jerusalem, that they would convert to Christianity. The envoy dispatched with this proposal was, however, slain by the Templars during his return journey, whereupon the assassins resumed their lethal campaigns. In 1192 they assassinated Conrad of Tyre at the instigation, it is reputed, of Richard the Lionheart. The assassins exacted tribute from the Christians of Tripoli and other regions, though their demands were successfully resisted by King Louis of France during his transit through Acre. The Persian branch of the assassins was finally crushed by the Mongols in 1256, and their Syrian counterparts were annihilated in 1270, although vestiges of the sect are reputed to persist in Persia to this day. Chapter 3. The Egyptians. The religious worship of the ancient Egyptians was multifaceted, characterized not only by a vast pantheon of deities, but also by diverse representations that verged closely upon pantheism, wherein numerous living creatures of the universe were deified. Consequently, a multitude of animals figured as divinities, such as the bull, the ram, the hawk, the crocodile, the serpent, and the cat. Solar worship also held a preeminent position, that celestial body being known under the appellations of Ra, Aten, and various others. Ra was the principal deity adored in that city, which subsequently acquired the Greek name of Heliopolis, or the city of the sun. Seb was the deity personifying the earth, who yielded to the husbandman her fruits in due season, aided by the god Hapi, the sacred river Nile, whose inundations irrigated the agrarian lands. Temples dedicated to the sun, or Ra, were prominent features in the majority of Egyptian municipalities, and the mysteries of solar worship occupied a vast hierarchy of priests who, as Herodotus relates in a word, employed a multitude of ceremonies. The rising and setting of the sun naturally constituted an allegory of human existence, with its cyclical phases of birth and mortality, and it is unsurprising to find developing alongside solar worship the veneration of those two celebrated Egyptian deities, Osiris and Isis. Osiris was reputed to have been a sovereign who ruled over Upper Egypt, espoused to Isis and envied by his brother, Set. The latter, through a cunning stratagem, drowned Osiris in the Nile, and the corpse was carried by the currents to the swamplands of the delta, where it was deposited upon the lower branches of an acacia tree, which subsequently enveloped and concealed it. Isis discovered, through magical arts, the location of the body and hid it in a secret place. There it was discovered by Set, who dismembered it into 14 pieces and scattered them in diverse locations. Nevertheless, the devoted Isis recovered and buried them. She then instructed her son Horus, assisted by his adherents, to perform the appropriate funerary rites, which successfully resurrected Osiris from the dead, establishing him as a divinity and sovereign of the underworld. This narrative is recounted in full by Plutarch in his treatise on Isis and Osiris, and there are numerous allusions to it in Egyptian inscriptions. It is noteworthy that in certain secret societies of subsequent eras, the Egyptian legends concerning the solar passage through the heavens, the murder of Osiris, and the recovery of his remains became embodied within the mysteries of those organizations. It is certain, from the evidence of the relics of ancient Egypt, the reliefs carved upon its tombs, and its monumental mortuary chambers, the pyramids, that mortality was the primary theme of these rites. Annually, the death of Osiris was commemorated, and a solemn procession was formed wherein an ark or boat, frequently depicted on Egyptian tombs, was borne on the priest's shoulders. This ark was reputed to contain a corpse in memory of the vessel which, drifting upon the Nile, bore the dismembered remains of Osiris down the river, echoing the narrative of a daughter of the pharaohs discovering a human body, in this instance, a deceased one, floating in an ark upon the sacred river. The temples of Egypt possess one distinctive feature that differentiates them from those of any other nation: the erection of external obelisks and the presence of numerous internal pillars, as exemplified by the monuments of Thebes and Karnak. These obelisks and pillars likewise served as the prototypes for analogous features found within the lodges of later fraternal societies. Herodotus, in the volume of his work entitled Euterpe, which treats of Egypt, describes several of the ceremonies of the Egyptian priesthood, and also discusses the colossal labyrinths shown to him by the priests, constructed upon the shore of Lake Moeris, this large body of water having been, in part, artificially constructed. These labyrinths, if the vivid accounts of French and other authors are to be credited, constituted a sanctuary for the magical and mystical ceremonies of the Egyptians, the rites being accompanied by dramatic effects of thunder and lightning, and by the startling manifestation of a radiant sun piercing the darkness. Thomas More, the poet, has provided a luminous description of certain of these ceremonies in his prose work, The Epicurean, published in 1839, which he supplements with annotations from numerous erudite scholars. The volume also contains illustrations of several of these scenes from the pencil of the artist James Mallard William Turner, Royal Academician. Chapter 4. The Pythagoreans. There is one figure whose name remains indissolubly linked with matters of scientific or mystical lore in bygone ages, namely the Greek philosopher Pythagoras, who lived between 580 and 500 BC, born on the island of Samos. His intellect inclined toward Hellenic philosophy, in which he achieved great proficiency. Greece was at this period profoundly influenced by Egyptian erudition, and it is unsurprising that Pythagoras journeyed to Egypt to study the wisdom of that country at its fountainhead. The priesthood served as the custodians of this learning, and, if tradition is to be credited, Pythagoras was initiated into their mysteries as well as instructed in their hieroglyphic writings. The human mind, ever credulous and prone to imagine that the marvelous is shrouded in the unknown, readily conceived that the hieroglyphs covering the temples and ancient sepulchres of Egypt held profound secrets of mystical rites and ceremonies. This assumption persisted undisturbed so long as the secrets of those curious writings remained locked. Modern research has, however, discovered the key to decipher them, and while they are found to contain historical records of the greatest interest and importance, they do not reveal any of those mysteries reputed to have been communicated to Pythagoras. The narrative, however, proceeds a step further, for our travelers' journeys were said to be contemporaneous with the Persian invasion of Egypt under Cambyses, the son of that Cyrus, king of Persia, who facilitated the return of the Jews from their Babylonian captivity. Cambyses, it is recounted, took Pythagoras with him upon his return to Persia, where the arcane wisdom of the Magi of that country was disclosed to him. Thus equipped with the ancient lore of two kingdoms, Pythagoras, then aged 40, returned first to his native land and subsequently to the Greek colony of Crotona, on the Gulf of Tarentum in southern Italy, where he established his own school of thought and attracted a vast body of disciples known as the Pythagoreans. His investigations led him primarily to the fields of astronomy, and he was the first to teach that the planets revolved in orderly succession about the sun, a doctrine derided for many centuries until Galileo demonstrated its veracity in the 16th century. These celestial movements he conceived to be such that musical harmonies were produced by their motion, hence designated the music of the spheres. Deriving directly from Egyptian intellectual traditions, the doctrine of the transmigration of the soul became also one of the branches of his philosophy, George Henry Lewes in his History of Philosophy having summarized these teachings of Pythagoras and those of his followers. In mathematics, he was a pioneering discoverer, and the honor of the famous 47th proposition of Euclid, concerning the properties of the square of the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle, is credited to him and not to Euclid. In three other respects, Pythagoras followed the Egyptians, the first being the inclusion of women among his disciples, among whom he numbered his own wife and 15 other ladies, the second being his abstinence from beans as food, for reasons connected with ancient legends, while the third was the employment by Pythagoras of ciphers and symbols in order to preserve the hermetic nature of his teachings. That the Pythagorean fraternity was a highly influential body is evident from the history of Italy, where his disciples participated in political struggles against the democratic faction, and were eventually compelled to flee from persecution. Regarding their mysteries, Herodotus informs us that the Pythagoreans were devotees of Orpheus and Bacchus, the latter name itself serving as a fundamental keynote to these esoteric rites. The same historian observes that it was deemed sacrilegious for an initiate of their mysteries to be interred in woolen garments, a prohibition for which a spiritual justification is provided. Furthermore, Herodotus recounts the history of a former slave of Pythagoras who, having acquired substantial wealth, constructed a subterranean habitation wherein he resided for 3 years, practicing the mysteries of the order so as to perpetuate the doctrines acquired from his master. Pythagoras himself is reported to have arrayed himself in the vestments of an Egyptian priest and to have submitted to the rite of circumcision, a condition indispensable to initiation into the sacred mysteries of that era. He also offered devotion to the deities in their temples at dawn and enjoyed an eminent reputation for sanctity. Novitiates who entered his school were forbidden to speak in his presence until they had completed 5 years of preparatory discipline, and he is said to have instructed them to communicate with one another using the symbolic characters he had acquired during his travels abroad. He expired circa 500 BC, whereupon he was venerated as a deity, and his dwelling place was revered as a temple. Chapter 5. The Eleusinians. It has ever been the propensity of nations to emulate one another in their philosophical paradigms, architecture, and ceremonial practices, a principle that was likewise manifest in the relations between the Egyptians and the Greeks. In process of time, the esoteric rites of the former civilization excited the emulation of their neighbors, by whom they were consciously or unconsciously imitated. Consequently, we find that in the year 1350 BC, the Greeks established certain solemnities which endured for a period of no less than 1800 years. These ceremonies occurred quinquennially in the month of September, spanning 9 days. They were enveloped in the profoundest secrecy under a solemn obligation of non-disclosure, the violation of which resulted in ostracism from society and liability to capital punishment. The festivals were celebrated in honor of Ceres, the goddess of agriculture and the harvest, and her daughter Proserpine. Initiates were drawn from both sexes, and participation in the rites was virtually mandatory. For those who declined to undergo the requisite ordeals were held in disrepute and deemed unworthy of the felicities of the afterlife. The order comprised 2 degrees, the lesser and the greater, the former serving as an indispensable prelude to the latter. The lesser mysteries were celebrated at Agri, near the Ilissus, and admission was restricted to individuals of unblemished character, and even then only upon their undergoing purification, prayer, and sacrifice, accompanied by the ceremonial aspersion of water. In the succeeding year, by receiving the second degree, the initiate advanced to the status of an inspector. This ceremony commenced nocturnally within a structure designated as the mystical temple, where the candidates were received by a presiding priest, styled the Hierophant, who expounded to them those fundamental tenets of philosophy and morality which dictated that a pure physical vessel must enshrine a pure mind. The Hierophant was assisted by 3 deacons and numerous subordinate officers. Following the recitation of certain moral admonitions inscribed upon stone tablets, a catechism was administered to the candidates. The mind of the novice, having been brought to a highly receptive state susceptible to external impressions, was then subjected to the quasi-magical arts of the Egyptians, whereby the phenomena of thunder, lightning, and earthquakes were simulated through some artificial agency. The subsequent days were devoted to sacred processions, sacrifices, and athletic contests. As an indication of the correlation between these mysteries and their Egyptian archetypes, as well as their influence upon subsequent secret rites which appear to have been modeled after them, it is highly significant that the officiating priest bore emblems representing the sun and the moon. Furthermore, on the concluding day of the solemnities, 2 earthen vessels were filled with wine, one positioned in the east and the other in the west, which was subsequently poured upon the earth as a libation, accompanied by the utterance of a mystical formula. By a natural progression of historical events, these mysteries, though originally instituted at Eleusis in Greece, subsequently established a domicile in Rome, far to the west, and ultimately ceased to exist during the reign of the Roman Emperor Theodosius the Great circa 450 AD. The precedent of Egypt was also observed in the dietary prohibition of beans, the justification offered being that such legumes were deemed impure by Ceres. Chapter 6. The Temple Builders. Freemasons have traditionally asserted that their craft originated among the Jews, and that the artificers of the first temple were the primordial Masons. Aside from the traditions preserved in the ancient charges of the operative Masons, which were transcribed by Dr. Anderson in the extensive historical treatise on Freemasonry contained within his celebrated Book of Constitutions, there exists no historical foundation for this narrative. Nevertheless, it holds such fascination for scholars of esoteric societies that, for the sake of lucidity, a historical account of this edifice and its builders is indispensable. The narrative derives support from the Jewish tradition that King Solomon possessed preeminent mastery of the magical arts, commanding dominion over the invisible realm, and that Tadmor in the wilderness was erected through his enchantments. The temple was constructed by King Solomon upon the plateau of Mount Moriah, to the east of the city of Jerusalem, its construction having commenced in 1012 BC and achieved completion in 1005 BC. Situated upon the summit of an eminence, it was approached by a series of steps leading first to a low wall that enclosed the court of the Gentiles. Within this perimeter stood another wall enclosing the court of the Israelites, into which no Gentile was permitted to enter, and within this precinct lay the sanctuary proper. At the western extremity, closest to Jerusalem, was situated the Holy of Holies, which housed the Ark, while the adjacent chamber was the holy place, containing the golden candelabrum, the table, and the altar of incense. Outside lay the temple court, which was accessed through the portico facing eastward toward the Mount of Olives. This orientation enabled the worshippers to behold the rising of the sun from that vantage point. In this respect, the temple was designed in a manner analogous to the Roman basilicas, presenting an arrangement diametrically opposed to that of Christian churches, the portals of which traditionally faced the west. Detailed particulars of the architecture are recorded in the First Book of Kings, chapters 6 and 7, as well as by Ezekiel in his vision of the temple, an edifice he had beheld with his own eyes, the description of which is set forth in the 40th chapter of his prophecy. The dimensions are specified in cubits, the customary unit of linear measure in the Near East, defined as the distance from an average man's elbow to the tip of his middle finger, or approximately 21 inches. Calculated on this basis, the total length of the temple was 108 feet, its height 54 feet, and its breadth 36 feet. Josephus, in his Antiquities, likewise describes the structure, which he asserts was constructed of a species of limestone quarried near Jerusalem, capable of being polished to resemble white marble. The subterranean foundations described by Josephus were subsequently investigated by Sir Charles Warren on behalf of the Palestine Exploration Fund, and his findings corroborate the historian's assertions regarding their profound depth. Among the most remarkable features of the temple were its porticos, of which there appear to have been several within the various courts. These included the portico of pillars, the portico of the throne wherein Solomon might dispense justice in the manner of Eastern potentates, and the portico before the temple proper, which is conjectured to have been a tower. This particular entrance was embellished with 2 hollow brass columns fabricated by Hiram the architect, which are described in detail both in the Book of Kings and by Josephus. The stature of these pillars is recorded by both authors as 18 cubits or 33 feet, though in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 3, verse 15, their height is stated to be 35 cubits or 63 feet, which may incorporate a portion of the steps designated in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 9, verse 4, as the king's ascent, by which he ascended into the house of the Lord. Scholarly opinions diverge regarding whether these columns stood detached from the edifice or supported the entablature, although the prevailing consensus inclines toward the former hypothesis. One aspect of the temple's design remains indisputably clear. Its architectural plan possessed no inherent originality, having been conceived merely as a grander replication of the tabernacle. This dearth of aesthetic novelty was likewise reflected in its ornamentation. Indeed, when Solomon petitioned the king of Tyre for assistance, which was patently deficient in Jerusalem at the period, a skilled artisan was dispatched from Tyre itself to provide the requisite creative vision at the site of construction. One may readily envision Hiram, the architect, contemplating those designs, which sought only to translate the ephemeral woodwork of the tabernacle into the more enduring medium of stone, and pondering how they might be elevated. His reflections would naturally have reverted to the temple situated in Tyre itself, which is thus described by the Greek historian Herodotus, and being desirous of obtaining reliable information from whatever source possible, I sailed to Tyre in Phoenicia, having heard that there existed a temple dedicated to Hercules, and I beheld it opulently adorned with a vast array of votive offerings, wherein stood 2 pillars, the one of pure gold, the other of emerald stone, both shining resplendently by night. The temple was presumably hypaethral, or open to the sky, and the historian thus depicts the magnificent spectacle of the pillars as they appeared beneath the brilliant moonlight. Hiram, upon being summoned to Jerusalem, might naturally have recalled these magnificent columns of the Tyrian temple, subsequently designing 2 others of distinct form and materials, yet intended to be no less remarkable than those of his native city, a place which, being virtually an island, had historically epitomized independence of both action and character. It may be observed that Herodotus inspected the temple at Tyre in 443 BC, approximately 550 years after the construction of the Temple of Jerusalem. However, regarding this temporal discrepancy, he explicitly records that the Tyrian priests assured him their temple had endured for 2,300 years. thereby indicating its existence prior to the reign of King Solomon. Whether the dual pillars within King Hiram's temple possessed any distinct religious significance, or were merely architectural necessities, remains a subject of inquiry. Nonetheless, it is noteworthy that among the Egyptians, the world's earliest monumental builders, from whom other civilizations, and presumably the Tyrians, derived their architectural concepts, pillars were held in profound veneration, the great Egyptian deity Osiris being revered as the Lord of the Pillars. Among the recurrent depictions in Egyptian sculpture is the grand festival of erecting the pillars, a solemnity in which the sovereigns assumed a prominent role. It is highly plausible that the columns situated at temple thresholds were adapted from ancient altars comprised of stone pillars, akin to the monument we read that Jacob erected at Bethel in early Hebrew antiquity, or those utilized by the Druids at Stonehenge for their sacrificial rites. The construction of Solomon's temple engaged a vast host of artisans, numbering in the thousands. A portion of this workforce was deployed to fell timber in the forests of Lebanon, whence the lumber was transported to the seaport of Tyre, conveyed by sea on rafts to Joppa, the modern Jaffa, and subsequently carted by road some 30 miles inland to Jerusalem. We are informed that the stones were entirely dressed and shaped at the quarries, ensuring that no sound of axe or chisel disturbed the serenity of the building site during its erection. Masonic tradition maintains that these craftsmen were confederated into a secret society under the governance of overseers, designated in the Hebrew text of the second book of Chronicles, chapter 2, verse 18, as the Monatskim, and that King Solomon presided as the Grand Master of this fraternity. The Solomonic Temple lasted for 400 years before its destruction by the Babylonians under the command of Nebuchadnezzar. Following the subsequent subjugation of Babylon by the Persians, King Cyrus permitted Ezra to return and rebuild the city of Jerusalem, whereupon Zerubbabel, laboring in conjunction with Ezra, erected the Second Temple. This edifice stood for upwards of 5 centuries until the era of Herod in 18 BC, who, observing its advanced state of dilapidation, resolved to reconstruct it in order to conciliate his Jewish subjects. Having accomplished this task, it was this rebuilt structure that served as the temple standing in Jerusalem during the lifetime of Christ. In 70 AD, Jerusalem was once more besieged, this time by Roman forces under the command of Titus, during which conflict Herod's temple was consumed by fire at the hands of the soldiery, contrary to the express wishes of their commander, who had sought to preserve it from destruction. Certain Masonic commentators have conjectured whether the selection of King Solomon's temple as the central allegory of Freemasonry might be attributed in some measure to Francis Bacon, who, in his utopian work The New Atlantis, conceptualized an island named Bensalem. This fictional realm possessed an institution designated as the House of Solomon, dedicated to the advancement of the arts and sciences under the guidance of a warden whose wisdom was inspired by Solomon himself. Thomas de Quincey, however, observes that this hypothesis must be fallacious, given that Bacon himself was a prominent opponent of the school of alchemists and Kabbalists, who are traditionally regarded as the progenitors of the Masonic order. Chapter 7. The Essenes. Among the most compelling of the ancient secret societies, and one that provided the foundational archetype for many of its successors, was a Jewish sect active in Palestine during the era of Christ, known as the Essenes, which flourished for nearly 3 centuries, from approximately 200 BC to 100 AD. For our historical record of this sect, we are indebted to 3 ancient authors, namely Josephus, the Jewish historian, who remained an initiate for 3 years without completing his full education within the sect, and who has provided the most detailed account, Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher, and the Roman writer Pliny the Younger. While Philo situates the community upon the shores of the Dead Sea, Josephus asserts that they possessed no single city, but were dispersed throughout various localities in Palestine. They are characterized as an ascetic offshoot of the Pharisees, residing in communal settlements under recognized leaders, professing rigorous adherence to the Mosaic law, and practicing extreme austerity in their daily lives, in a manner reminiscent of John the Baptist. Though they did not disparage the institution of marriage, they observed celibacy, adopting the offspring of others when they discovered promising pupils. They emulated the Stoics in their repudiation of sensual pleasures and their disdain for material wealth, regarding charity and virtue as their sole riches. They appear to have constituted a very early monastic order. Indeed, they led a life of strict devotion, rising before dawn for prayer, and abstaining from all secular conversation until that luminary had appeared. They were egalitarian in practice, holding all possessions in common under the administration of designated stewards. By this means, the members avoided the extremes of both opulence and destitution, whilst they rejected the concept of servitude as contrary to the fundamental equality of all men within their fraternity. Following morning devotions, which were recited according to a prescribed liturgy, they labored for several hours at tasks designated by their curators. Upon a given signal, they assembled to bathe in cold water, subsequently donning white vestments in the vestibule of their communal hall. Thereupon, they proceeded to the refectory, where each initiate was served a single loaf and a solitary dish of food, the meal being both preceded and concluded by a benediction pronounced by a priest. No uninitiated persons were permitted to attend this morning repast, which occurred at the 11th hour and consisted of bread, salt, and hyssop. At its conclusion, the white vestments were again deposited in the vestibule, and labor was resumed until evening, when supper was served in a similar solemn manner. On this latter occasion, however, guests might be admitted. All actions were performed in strict conformity with prescribed rules and in profound silence. General conversation was prohibited, but should anyone desire to speak, he was permitted to do so in his proper turn and without interruption from others, so that no man ventured to speak unless he possessed some matter of significance or originality to discuss. The destitute were cared for and charity was distributed. However, to preclude any appearance of partiality, no individual was permitted to bestow alms directly upon his own kinsman, any claim of that nature being referred to the curators for administration. They dedicated their leisure to the study of the writings of the ancient Hebrew authors, acting as emissaries of peace to all men. They restrained their anger, each individual treating his word as an inviolable bond and eschewing oaths, save for those administered as part of the ritual of their society. Josephus observes that he perceived a striking similarity between their doctrines and those of the Pythagoreans, the most prominent tenets of the Essenes being a belief in a resurrection after death, a day of judgment, and the retribution of the wicked. Should anyone desire to gain admission to the order, he was received as a probationer, participating in their common life for the duration of a year, and being provided with a small spade, a linen apron, which served also as a towel, and a white vestment to be worn at meal times. There appears to have been no prescribed uniform worn by the members. Nevertheless, it is recorded that they wore their garments until they were reduced to tatters, at which point replacements were provided by the curators, each man being restricted to a single change of raiment and one pair of shoes. Upon the expiration of a year, the candidate attained the status of a novice and underwent a form of baptismal rite, thereafter continuing in association with the brethren for an additional 2 years. If, after this protracted probation, he successfully met all tests to the satisfaction of the brethren, he was elected to membership in the society. Yet, before he was admitted to the full privileges of the order and permitted to join his brethren in their daily routine and communal meals, he was obliged to take what Josephus characterizes as tremendous oaths, which bear a profound analogy to those of the secret societies of subsequent epochs. He bound himself by oath, first, to observe piety toward his God, and second, to maintain justice toward his fellow men, covenanting to do them no harm, whether of his own volition or at the instigation of others, to abhor the wicked, and to succor the righteous. He further swore to be a loyal citizen, to manifest respect for those in authority, and, if elevated to power, never to abuse his office nor endeavor to surpass his subordinates in attire or personal adornment, whilst keeping his hands clean of theft and his lips free from falsehood. Finally, with respect to the order, he swore to conceal nothing from his brethren, never to disclose to outsiders the secrets he received from them, to preserve the constitutions of the order without alteration, and to guard with utmost vigilance the books wherein their mysteries were recorded. Their numbers do not appear to have exceeded 4,000, and since they maintained a low profile within the Jewish world, no direct reference to them is found in the New Testament, unless it be in those passages wherein the taking of oaths is forbidden, namely Matthew 5:34 and James 5:12, and in those concerning the adoration of angels, which constituted a part of the religious ceremonies of this sect. There existed in Egypt, during the era of Philo, another Jewish society known as the Therapeutae, who are frequently classified alongside the Essenes, although there remains no evidence to suggest they observed the rites and ceremonies of the latter body. In his treatise on the contemplative life, Philo records that they inhabited cells for the purpose of speculative study, and assembled for communal prayer on the Sabbath day. By certain authors they are characterized as contemplative Essenes, and Eusebius saw fit to claim them as Christians, an assertion prompted, in all probability, merely by the fact that their mode of worship differed from that of the Egyptians among whom they resided. Chapter 8. The Roman Builders. Upon the founding of a new city, one naturally expects to find engineers, architects, and builders assembling there in great numbers. Thus, it is by no means surprising to learn that during the legendary epoch of Romulus, the founder and first monarch of Rome, numerous citizens embraced the craft of building. By the time the second king, Numa Pompilius, ascended the throne in 629 BC, the art of construction had made significant progress. Distinct trades had become established, and artisans had begun to organize themselves into guilds. Among these associations, one was reputed to be a guild of masons, notwithstanding the fact that the primary architectural preference of the Romans was to construct their works of concrete rather than stone. These guilds, in common with those of later epochs, patronized apprentices, and maintained some form of initiating novices into the craft, governed by salutary rules of personal conduct and regulations for the administration of the guild and its assemblies. Nevertheless, these bodies can scarcely be said to merit the designation of a secret society. Intimately connected with this subject is the legend of the 4 crowned martyrs, a narrative that has perennially held profound interest for Masons. The account dates back to the era of the Christian persecutions under the Emperor Diocletian, circa 300 AD. It is recorded that there were 5 Christian Masons, or sculptors, in Rome who were commanded to carve pagan statues, a task which, owing to religious scruples, they steadfastly refused to execute. Having been condemned to death, they suffered martyrdom, and would have been venerated as the 5 crowned martyrs, were it not for the circumstance that 2 years later, while Diocletian pursued his tyrannical course, for Christian soldiers incurred his wrath by refusing to burn incense upon the altar of the god Aesculapius. These 4 likewise paid the ultimate penalty for their devotion to the faith, joining the noble army of martyrs. Tradition asserts that the deaths of both the initial 5 and the subsequent 4 transpired on the 8th of November, separated by an interval of 2 years. 4 years later, in 304 AD, Diocletian, having relinquished the reins of government, sought retirement in a villa at Salona in Dalmatia. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.